the conversation, if you could put it down in the chat function, and I'll try to get to it. I can't guarantee I'll get to them all, and experience tells me that this can be a little bit unpredictable in terms of the rate at which it comes through. So do forgive me if I do miss you, but I'll try and cover as many as possible when we get to the Q&A section. We can also use the chat function for networking. In these days where networking opportunities are few and far between, if you do want to introduce yourself via the chat function, maybe put your email address up there if you feel that's appropriate, then people can contact you if you've got a particular interest. You're welcome to do that. We'll start this session. So my name's Rob Grundy. I'm Interim Chief Executive of the Health Innovation Research Alliance for Northern Ireland, HIRANI. This is the fourth, I think, of our series of fireside chats, and today's subject is diagnostics, which has come into sharp focus over the past 6 months, given the nature of the COVID pandemic and the way we've had to handle it. Having run a diagnostics company in the past and been involved in innovation around diagnostics, it's sometimes felt a little neglected or poorly understood in the past as an area of research and applied medical science. And the commercialization has been very difficult, to say the least. And so it'd be interesting to explore in this session where we're at with diagnostics in the wake of COVID and whether that's changed our perception of diagnostics, the utility and potential commercialization as we emerge from the situation we're in at the minute. So onto the panel, and I'm very honoured and pleased that we've got a diverse and high-profile panel today to talk about this with us. So first of all, we have Tara Moore, who's a professor of personalised medicine at Ulster University. She's also Chief of Research and Innovation at Avellino Labs, and she's part of the UK consortium that have been put together to develop antibody tests in response to COVID. We have Richard Kennedy, who's Professor of Medical Oncology at Queen's University Belfast, but also holds the position of Global Vice President of Biomarker Development and is the Medical Director at Almac. Maurice O'Kane joins us, who's a consultant from the Western Trust. Maurice is also the Director of the Northern Ireland Clinical Research Network. And last but by no means least, we have Chris Molloy, who is, of course, the CEO of the Medicines Discovery, Catapult, and has been leading the UK Lighthouse Labs initiative to dramatically increase testing capacity for COVID across the UK. So welcome all of you, and welcome to all the participants. Hopefully this will be an interesting session for you. So let's start by addressing the most obvious question here, which is, of course, where are we at? The question on everyone's lips, at least alone the leads of the 9 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news. I'm showing my age there. Is where are we at with testing capability COVID-19? And I think we'll start with the sharpest end of this, which is testing for viral infection. So, Chris, it seems that you're the most appropriate go-to guy here, given that you're leading the national effort here in terms of the logistics and capability. Where are we at? How are we coping with the demand from a viral testing point of view?
Well, thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. The short answer is we're coping very well. We have over the last 100 days tested over 2.5 million subjects across the whole of the United Kingdom. We have 4 laboratories working intensively 24 hours a day to provide that capacity and to do that in a timely way. And we have capacity that's significantly in excess of 100,000 a day. So, and the demand on that capacity goes up and down on a daily basis. It changes with things as significant as the weather and the movements of the virus around the nation. And we do see waves of demand as things go up and down across the country. We'll continue to increase that capacity because we know that this is not going away. We may have seen phase one. We are still in phase one, despite the gradual release from lockdown. There are still areas of the country where we're seeing small or localized outbreaks, and we need to be fast to respond to those. Fast to identify, fast to confirm, fast to intervene. So the capacity will need to increase over the summer months, whatever the demand looks like, because of the realization that come September, October, as the weather changes, there will be increased demands for that capacity, and we must be ready. There was significant concern back in March when the Lighthouse Lab project was first started that perhaps we were not ready enough. Come the autumn time, we must be ready. And as a nation, we shall be ready. It's a combination effort. This is a team sport. There are no, individual players here. It's a combination of players. So if you look at the Lighthouse network that comprises Milton Keynes, Alderley Park, Glasgow, and Cambridge, and is also supported by Randox in Antrim, you've got a diversity there of organisations who are hosting. You've got a diversity of assay platforms, and you've got an army of volunteers. Actually over 1,000 volunteers over the first 100 days who've given of themselves to come and work in the middle of the night to test on behalf of the nation. So that describes a system that has managed well in a crisis period, and that now needs to and is converting to a foundation for the future. And I think that we'll probably come back to this discussion later on during this fireside chat about what this foundation can support in terms of a diagnostics industry for the future, a translational activity for the future, so that we are not in a position in 12 months' time saying, why haven't we got a diagnostics industry?
I think that's a great point, Chris, and I think the legacy of the investment we've made in this, I think sets up the industry, the diagnostics industry, well to go forward. And I think exploiting that is key. You saw what a well-developed diagnostic industry can do for countries like Germany, that's where it's already there and has a strong foundation. And I think if we can build a similar foundation going forward based on the work that you've done to prepare us for this particular instance, that'd be wonderful. Richard, I mean, you've been part of the local provision of through Almac's resources, part of the local provision for monitoring viral infection. How, as providing kind of increased bandwidth locally, how have you found the experience, and how do you feel it's been sufficiently effective?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of learning probably from both sides over the last few months. Initially, the strategy in Northern Ireland would be to engage the hospitals and the academic institutes, and then it was later that industry was engaged. For us, we typically have not been delivering for direct-to-patient type testing or for NHS. We've been doing delivery mostly for pharmaceutical companies. So it's been a bit of a change for us, learning the regulations, if you like, for delivering within an NHS network. But that's been good. We've learned a lot about the restrictions and the requirements. And really within Northern Ireland, similar to what Chris had said, within Northern Ireland at the moment, between the academic institutes, the hospitals and the local industry, we actually have a comfortable level of testing. What we have our eye towards, though, is again, as Chris mentioned, into the autumn, because it's not just the potential rise again in COVID cases and that around autumn, but it's the other testing that the hospitals will have to perform as well, because you're going to have your standard seasonal flu rises, and also we are relying somewhat on ABFI, which is our veterinary testing laboratories as well, and they'll be moving into the season when they have avian flu and bovine tuberculosis, other things they should be testing for. So we have all this in mind, but there are provisions for that. But I think, yes, I think certainly it's been a good experience. And I think it's probably tightened up our links with the NHS, which has been a good thing, because traditionally we really didn't have that much. And I think Randox probably have had a similar experience.
Excellent. Thanks, Richard. And I suppose turning now towards the antibody piece, it's been an interesting journey observing the struggle to get a predictable antibody test that everybody can get behind. So Tara, it'd be good if you could explain a little bit about the consortium, the UK consortium that's been put together to try to address this, and perhaps give a view on where we're at with the quality and the provision for antibody testing.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rob. Firstly, to touch on existing capability, obviously within the NHS, within the different trusts across Northern Ireland, they're actively providing antibody tests at the moment. So a lot of NHS staff and frontline workers have already been able to access antibody tests through either the Roche or the Abbott system, albeit that does require a blood sample and it requires a laboratory test. But it's important to stress that that is ongoing and that is happening daily and has been now for a couple of weeks for staff. So some staff have been able to be told, you do have antibodies. I'm not sure if we're going to touch on what that actually means or how long they will last. In terms of the UK Rapid Test Consortium, you're aware that in very early days in March, Oxford took on a challenge to assess a lot of the existing lateral flow, the instant point of care antibody testing systems available. They tested them on an initial cohort of about 9 skiers that returned from a ski trip into Brighton, and they were not particularly sick, but they were hospitalised because it was at a very early stage of COVID hitting the UK. They had very low titers of antibodies. Therefore, that was a very stringent test for any lateral flow to pass. So there is a publication out there that would indicate a lot of those, or the ones that they tested, did not reach the standards that they would require to be reliable. As a consequence of that, this UK RTC was formed. It involves people like Abington, BBI and Amiga, along with SIGA Healthcare here in Northern Ireland. And universities such as Oxford, Imperial and ourselves at Ulster University have been more involved in the evaluation and validation of the kits at each of the stages as they progress them. It has involved a lot of hard work, a lot of material chemistry, material sciences, as well as the immunology aspect of it. We're now at the stage where we're testing large cohorts of hundreds of very well characterized known positives and known negatives that would have backup serology information in terms of ELISAs and other tests. So we're at that stage of finalising those types of tests on large numbers to be able to say that we have a test that has the best detection limit possible, you know, to allow the best sensitivity. And that's
okay. No, that's great. That's great, Tara, because I'm sure many people are wondering, you know, how far we're getting towards a test that everybody can get behind, and that's great to hear. I'm going to bring Maurice in now. So Maurice, just kind of broadening the conversation out, kind of beyond COVID a little bit, but I'm also interested on your view on how from the clinical perspective. But how do you think the current crisis and the employment of diagnostics has affected clinical practice in regard to the use of these tools?
Okay, so thanks, Rob. So I think one of the major points about this is that COVID has shone a spotlight like never before on the importance of diagnostic testing. And I think, Rob, in your introduction, you mentioned that diagnostics was a relatively neglected facet of clinical medicine. But, you know, for the last 100 days, every day on the news, we hear about numbers of tests, positive tests, negative tests, what results mean. So I think as part of the outpouring of that, there will be a much better understanding amongst the public about the importance of testing, and indeed amongst other healthcare professionals. I mean, there's an old adage that's been kicking around laboratory medicine for years now. There's where it actually came from, nobody is terribly sure, but the adage is that 70% of all clinical decisions are informed by laboratory testing. And so that really shows the importance of laboratory testing. And in the COVID outbreak, so rapid COVID testing has been really important, firstly, clearly for making diagnoses on patients, but also for controlling patient flow through hospitals, which has been really important for, so that patients can be put in COVID areas or non-COVID areas. So all that has really been important. So I've worked in laboratory medicine for about 30 years now, and this is the first time that there has ever been this huge focus on the importance of laboratory testing. And some of you may remember various reports produced by Lord Carter. In the last 5 or 6 years, he reviewed pathology services in England and produced reports on these. And his reports were really all around the cost of laboratory services. And these have been very influential, but they have focused on laboratory service really as a cost as opposed to something that provides value. And sort of one of his headline figures that was taken up was that pathology services should cost, I think, less than 3% of total trust budgets. So there's nothing in that about quality, nothing in that about clinical utility, and nothing in that about value. So I think if anything good comes out of this, it's a focus on the value of laboratory testing and how we can't look at laboratory testing simply as a cost. We look at it as something that provides value to patient care and something that contributes directly to patient outcomes. So, for me, that is the really important thing about this really, really bright spotlight on the role of laboratory testing.
Thanks, Maurice. And that kind of stimulates a question in my mind, and I suppose I'll ask Chris this, and I'm sure the answer is you've been too busy to look at it, but has the operating the light test labs, in retrospect, is there a pharmacoeconomic analysis to be done as to the benefit that an appropriately deployed diagnostic tool might make to the patient pathway? I know it's an extraordinary situation, but it's always the pharmacoeconomic bit that's the hardest to achieve, I find, when you have the commercialization plan for a diagnostic presented to a trust or something like that.
Yeah, and I haven't got any numbers on it for COVID as you'd probably expect, but from a pharmaceutical perspective, people have talked about companion diagnostics for a long time, and one of the things that BIVDA has done very, very usefully, I think, is start to talk about diagnostic dependent drugs. And actually, I think it's a really nice way of thinking about it, that actually drugs start to become a function of the diagnostic rather than there's a sort of companion diagnostic that goes along with it. Because the clinical decision is around whether to intervene and how. And the deployment of an individual clinical intervention, which may be drug or change in lifestyle or whatever it may be, will be dependent on what the clinician knows about you as a patient. And if that decision is better informed by a more rounded, multifunctional diagnostic, then you're going to make a more rounded decision. Now, I think the pharmacoeconomic or the economic benefit of having a more rounded diagnostic has probably been brought into sharper focus by this recent last 100 days. If you think about it, we're all trying to go for quite simplistic diagnostics, binary yes, no type decisions. If we know more about this coronavirus than the 10 or 15 coronaviruses that went before it. We could have investigated all of these diseases for their impact on different demographics, their effect on people with different background morbidities. We didn't, because it wasn't as severe. But the more that we can find out about these diseases by better diagnostics, be they genomics or a combination of genomics and biochemical or molecular biology type outputs, rounded clinical decisions we shall make. So, and in that become the diagnostic dependent drugs.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think you're right. I think that area will mature very quickly. And I suppose, Richard, it's your stock in trade at Almac to provide this kind of support. Before COVID, that's Almac Diagnostics' business model was to provide prognostic markers and companion diagnostics. How do you feel that has changed given the last 6 months of activity?
Yeah, it's probably there's a couple of things. First of all, there's, I suppose, partly it has moved a number of the diagnostic companies more towards virology. I think it's fair to say we didn't do that much work in the virology sphere unless there was a direct drug involved. But this has now got an interest in testing again, and the importance of rapid testing and reliable results. So certainly that's changed. The other interesting thing that happened in all this is that we fully thought that when this happened, our other work we were doing with the pharmaceutical companies would dry up, because we work with clinical trials, we do this sort of work. but actually, if anything, it increased. And that's, I think that's probably more towards a unique situation in Northern Ireland, in that we probably didn't have as high a level as other places, and our laboratories continued to work. So there was actually a shift of work towards the clinical. I know Randox saw a similar upswing as well. So that was an immediate impact as well on business. Speaking to the companion diagnostics sphere, just even outside this, in the last 3 years, we've seen a big increase in the amount of work for companion diagnostics and trials, largely because of the activities of the FDA in this space and EMA. They're really mandating now that pharmaceutical companies, particularly in the cancer sphere, have a companion diagnostic, or if they don't, they have to have a really good reason not to. And if you do have a diagnostic, then it must be properly analytically validated. So there's work that has to go along with that. And that's really a lot of what we do. That's definitely increasing. The other thing actually that's changed recently is there's more of a move in pharma too for targeting diseases related to polymorphisms and germline type mutations, polymorphisms. So I'm thinking the likes of the neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's disease, and where you're doing that, again, you've got to have a diagnostic assay to run alongside. You've got to be able to identify these. And again, it's the same stipulations from the regulatory authorities that you must be able to demonstrate the analytical validity of your assay for the purposes of submission and regulation of the drug. So all that, I've seen a rapid change in that over the last 2 or 3 years.
Interesting. So, I mean, you kind of preempt my next question, and this is where we get a little bit Northern Ireland centric, which is fine, because that's why HIRANI's here, and that is, you know, is Northern Ireland well set up to cater for this increased interest in the provision of diagnostic tools? Now, I'm conscious that you know, you mentioned obviously you represent Almac, but you mentioned Randox as well, which is in many people's consciousness. There are also a handful of smaller companies that focus on diagnostics in Northern Ireland as well. So Tara, you mentioned Sega Healthcare, but also Fortress, Biopanda, a number of others. And what I'm interested in is whether you think we are well set up to take advantage of that in Northern Ireland. And I would encourage. I don't see any questions coming through on the chat now, but I know there are a number of folk on the chat that do have interest in this area. If you do have a question or want to contribute, don't be shy. Put it in the chat box, and I'll try and weave the question into the debate here. But I suppose it'd be good to reflect on whether we think we can take advantage of it in Northern Ireland. I don't know, Maurice, from a clinical perspective, do you see scope for increasing clinical testing of innovative diagnostics in Northern Ireland?
So thanks, Rob. So I think one of the big challenges is going to be the clinical assessment of the utility of diagnostic tests. You know, so if you Google promising biomarkers, which I did last night, you get something like 45 million hits, but yet very, very few of these make their way through into clinical practice. And there are lots of reasons for that, and it's been well documented. But one of the reasons is that there is very, very poor evaluation of diagnostic tests outside the companion diagnostic field. And I think that is a major challenge now. To some extent, legislation is going to address that. So, for example, the European Union in vitro diagnostics directive now requires, well, from whenever it's implemented in 2022, will require clinical evidence of utility, which was never required before. So all the diagnostics companies are now looking at how they get clinical evidence of utility. And if you compare a diagnostic test to, say, a pharmaceutical product, so pharmaceutical products, you know, it's a very highly regulated environment. They have to go through stringent testing, both for safety, but also clinical effectiveness. It is not the same for diagnostic tests. Certainly up to the present. So there has been a huge amount of waste, and a large number of diagnostic tests, you know, have failed at the last stage when they're rolled out into clinical practice. They're just not terribly effective because they don't have the diagnostic performance criteria. So I think there is a huge bit of work to be done around assessing the clinical utility of diagnostic tests. And I think Northern Ireland is well placed to do that. So, for example, in CTRIC, we have got the Centre for Clinical Decision Making and Patient Safety. And one of the focus of that has been the assessment of diagnostic tests, including point of care testing. So, so as well as biomarker discovery, I think we are well placed to do the equally important bit about demonstrating clinical utility and clinical value. And if you can demonstrate clinical utility and clinical value, then that straight away makes the case for adoption and funding.
Excellent. And thanks for that, Maurice. So Tara, I mean, I know you have a foot in both the academic and the industry camps, and Avellino isn't strictly a diagnostics company, but the platform can be employed towards that, and I know diagnostics are part of the journey of technology development from your perspective. So both from a biotech and a UU perspective, how do you see Northern Ireland being set up to take advantage of this potential opportunity?
Well, I think we've probably learnt a lot from the current situation, and we've learnt how quickly we can move into a very fast gear and move things forward at a pace that probably we never imagined we could achieve before. Hopefully, as a result of this UK consortium, it places even just Siga Healthcare in an ideal position where they're hoping to manufacture something like 400,000 or help with the processing of 400,000 of these lateral flow tests for COVID-19 antibodies a week. So to even be able to show that capability of 400,000 tests a week is a huge achievement for a small Northern Ireland company. And we're obviously learning a lot about the chemistry and the various elements that make a successful home-based test. So it may well be that this will open up on opportunities for a lot more home testing. And healthcare may have to change if we move into a second wave of this. And we all know the various elements of being able to seek even a GP to get a blood sample or to be able to get any kind of medical attention. That has dropped drastically during the early stage, was when people were so frightened to go out and GPs and various healthcare providers were closed.
Thanks, Tara. And Chris, I suppose not being in Northern Ireland, but having familiarity with what we do over here and having a unique perspective from where you are in the MDC with the Lighthouse Labs. Do you think A, Northern Ireland, but B, the UK as a whole can use this as a springboard to drive forward this particular part of the industry?
Yeah, no question. The answer is it's yes. It has to be yes. And I'm fortunate enough to chair the Belfast-based company Exploristics, and that company which uses real-world data and clinical trial simulation to help the adoption of diagnostics as well as new medicines, is seeing the COVID experience that everyone's had has shaken the clinical trials system. It's been that crisis point that's shown that the old way of doing clinical trials, the very expensive, very large, very slow approach that we've had to take over many years, has been fundamentally shown not to work in response to COVID. If we want to think differently post-COVID, it has to be about the use of things like real-world evidence to drive the adoption of these types of interventions in a way that doesn't have to wait 3 or 4 years, that can actually take cohorts in a short amount of time, profile them well through diagnostics and biomarkers to be able to put them into a treatment and an intervention group while they've actually still got the condition, and you can look at their real world evidence and use simulations and to be able to project efficacy. This is going to fundamentally change how clinical trials are done worldwide. And I think the UK, Northern Ireland, has excellent capability in this space, in software and in the clinical trials framework. So I see a big change coming. And COVID has changed even Big Pharma's view, as well as biotechs like Exploristics, Big Pharma's view on how clinical trials really need to be run for the future.
Yeah, great point, Chris. And I suppose Richard and Maurice, you're both effectively clinical trialists, and more intensely, Richard, recently been your redeployment back into the front line of the NHS. Chris mentions real-world evidence there as forming part of the diagnostics clinical trial process. From where I sit, I see real-world evidence as having massive potential, but easier said than done. How do you think we're set up as the HSC, a healthcare organisation in Northern Ireland, to deal with that element of clinical trials as they mature? Maurice, first of all.
Okay, so I think Chris made a very good point. Clinical trials, as we have known them in the past, are incredibly expensive and slow, and certainly for diagnostics, they are more difficult again, because from when you do a diagnostic test to the patient benefit or detriment, that is often way downstream from the testing element. So it immediately follows from that clinical trials of diagnostics, apart from things like companion diagnostics, can be very, very challenging. So there's now an increasing emphasis on using data modeling. So you can gather some relatively limited information on analytical performance and clinical performance, and then use modeling techniques to predict the impact of that on clinical outcomes and the detriments in clinical outcomes. So I think that's going to become increasingly important in assessing diagnostics. I think Northern Ireland is well set up to do that. Certainly COVID has shown that we have got very significant modelling expertise available locally, and we've got very, very significant data analytics expertise available locally. And I think this is going to be extremely important for the future of diagnostics.
Thanks, Maurice. Richard, what's your perspective on that? Practically, are we set up to take advantage from a clinical network perspective, from the ability to run these trials within the clinics?
Yeah, I think I suppose because I obviously have been involved in clinical trials to the university as well. Like a lot of universities, there's always issues running trials within trusts. There's conflicting views about waiting lists and getting things moved through. We've all had that. It's not unique to Northern Ireland. I think perhaps the most recent experiences have shown the importance of doing these kind of studies. And now, again, actually, back to Maurice's point earlier, for the first time, I'm now hearing my clinical colleagues talking to me about sensitivity and specificity of tests, and am I absolutely certain that this test is going to be, well, it doesn't have false positives or false negatives, or so that dialogue has started. That appreciation what a molecular test is, and what it involves. So there is, I think, the appreciation too that the labs do this kind of work, what it takes to get one through. One word of caution I'd have in all this enthusiasm, though, is we don't lose the importance of quality and the importance of proper validation. I'm sure you've probably been following the situation in the US, where the FDA allowed a number of assays to go through quickly and be marketed before they were proven, and now they're in the unfortunate situation where they're reeling them back now because the real world evidence is they don't work. So I don't think that's a good way to test a biomarker either, is real world data by it didn't work and people came to harm potentially. So there is a balance here.
Okay, that's a really good point. It's always the tension to marry that kind of ambition to forge ahead and provide impact for patients and get things commercialized also against is it really going to deliver on its promise?
Well, simulation, I think, Rob, has a big role to play here. You measure twice, cut once.
Right.
So, if you can use simulations and you can use modelling more effectively. Now, we've been in a 100-day pell-mell rush globally to do this. So these are not normal times. But as we move into the new normal, where old world clinical trials are very much the view of the past, the real world clinical trials are the sign of the future, and they may only be 1.6 billion of a $64 billion market, but they are absolutely on the rise, and everyone better get with the program, because this is the direction of travel. That's for using diagnostics as part of real world, but also driving the adoption of diagnostics as part of real world. So but modeling and simulation, I think, will help us get away from trying and testing and trying and failing.
Excellent. Okay, listeners, I'm getting quite paranoid. I've not had any questions on the chat, so either you're all incredibly shy, or as I feared, my chat refresh isn't performing the way it should do. If we've got about 20 minutes left here, I've still got plenty of questions to ask the panel, but if you do have a burning question and I haven't addressed it, you can also raise your hand on the raise the hand option on Teams here, and I'll try and bring you in because I've not seen any questions yet. If someone wants to ask me my favourite colour, then they'll give you some confidence that the system's working in the interim. So,
Rob, I can see a question actually that's on here from somebody on the meeting chat, which is from Brendan McGann. Hi, Rob, great panel. I'd be interested to know the panel's thoughts on the role of patients, if any, in the development and adoption of diagnostic tests.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Brendan. I haven't got that, so there is something wrong with my system. Okay, I'm going to bring Tara in here because I know, Tara, you're not a clinician, but you're in the middle of testing a load of patients in your own study. You might tell us a little bit about that study, but also kind of give your insight into how patient interface is going in that regard.
Yeah, so firstly, we couldn't do it without the patients. And our first aspect of the study, we needed to recruit 200 or 300 individuals that were known PCR positive, that were most likely to be IgG positive, to obviously evaluate the lateral flow point of care test. So we did a call for that through Northern Ireland, and we've got about 7,000 people volunteering and coming forward. So their serology and being able to get blood from those known positives has been absolutely critical, and we have to thank those, what we wouldn't call patients, but members of the Northern Ireland community that have been infected with the virus. Secondly, Northern Ireland will be the site for the UX study, the user study, to show that when these kits are sent out to homes by the UK government free to assess antibodies present in their finger prick blood, can people use them? Is there a problem with the lancet? Is there a problem with trying to get the blood off? All the steps in the process for regulatory bodies in terms of a user study is going to take place in Northern Ireland through Ulster University. And again, it's critical that we get the 2,000 to 3,000 volunteers for that. Not necessarily people that have had the virus, but people that will want to be able to test for antibodies for whatever reason that they might need to know. And lastly, the big question that everyone is asking is, when we detect antibodies, will it reflect anything to do with longevity, neutralizing antibodies, immunity, the ability to fight the infection if we happen to get another exposure to it in the future? So part of our Ulster University study will to be called back in all the positive serology patients at various times over the next year to reassess them. So that's a fair bit of commitment on anyone in terms of a patient who's prepared to keep coming back to us for us to continue to assess their blood for the presence of those antibodies.
Great, thanks, Tara. And it's great to hear about that study because I know it's really important. There's been a lot of enthusiasm in the public for it as well, clearly. But Maurice, from your perspective as a practicing clinician, what role does the patient play as we enter this brave new diagnostic world?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So that's a very good question. So I think the important point here is that clinical testing or laboratory testing cannot be seen in isolation. Laboratory testing must always be seen in the context of a clinical care pathway. And increasingly, we try to involve our patients when we are designing our care pathways. And pathology testing or laboratory testing is part and parcel of that. So patients do have a very central role. And and we can't look at diagnostic testing in isolation. It's always embedded in a care pathway.
Brilliant. Okay, Maurice. Well, before I go back to my new co-chair to pick out a question of his choice, Chris, given that you can see these things that I can't, clearly diagnostics has become something of major importance here, and I wonder whether this will become more of a strategic area of investment for the government as we go forward. I'm involved in policy development through my work with Matrix. We see a lot of strategic nudges in certain directions from government based on industrial strategy, policy, and etc. I wonder if we'll see more of the kind of calls that will help develop the industry going forward. After this, and I'll go to Chris for this because, of course, the Catapult is part of the funding network from government, and I'm wondering whether you see something strategic coming out of this at the government level.
Well, I probably ought to just state up front that actually, although the Catapult benefits from a grant from Innovate UK, it's not a fund. It's not involved in funding or a provider of funding to anybody. We share our resources and our skills in sort of R&D collaborations. That's the way in which we work. I mean, there's no question, however, that the UK has to see the stimulation of a diagnostics and industry as a strategic must, and how we go about translating the academic endeavour that we have in this nation with the industrial rigour that is necessary to turn those into new effective products and services. That's a natural bridging point. It's the call it valley of death or whatever it may be that's been there and is quite broad and deep for diagnostics. No question that stimulation is necessary, but also practical support is necessary. I don't think just throwing money at the problem is the solution. You've got to throw resources and skills and experience into the mix in order to be able to turn the ideas into new, effective, marketable, commercializable products and services. Otherwise, I think we're just turning the handle, and we shouldn't be doing that. We should be really focused, I think, now on taking the very best academic endeavour, matching it with industrial rigour, and putting a target of a certain number of new diagnostics and effective biomarkers into the market in the next 2 or 3 years.
Any other thoughts on government support? I'm conscious a number of us will be in receipt of and will be applying for grants going forward. I don't know if we want to kind of raise any questions on the chat. I don't know if Chris, is there anything coming up in response to that?
There's a question from there's actually loads of questions coming up, my goodness. So there's a question from Adam Harvey. Recently, PGA golfer Nick Watney correctly suspected he had contracted COVID after an initial negative test based on data from his fitness tracker. With that in mind, could this kind of data be considered alongside genomic, biochemical, and other testing during the diagnostics process for COVID? So the multifunctional varietal diagnostic.
That's a great question, and I've lost count of the number of Innovate UK grants that I've read as my role as an assessor that have tried to integrate kind of wearable vital signs in this. But it's always struck me as a little bit of a blunt instrument. I don't know, Richard, you were nodding there. Do you have a kind of point of view on this?
It probably just goes towards the bigger point. As a clinician, you never base a diagnosis on a single test. You take all the information, and if a fitness tracker provides information, you'll factor that in like everything else. And we know that these assays, for the PCR perspective, there may be a false negative rate of about 20%. And that's just purely because of sampling. There's not a lot you can do about that. It's not a problem per se with the PCR assay. It's a problem of what goes in. But if somebody comes along, got florid symptoms suggestive of COVID-19, and the fitness tracker supporting that, I think you're probably going to treat them as a COVID-19 and retest.
Yeah, Rob, and there has been some studies out there showing that in the first few days of acute infection, again, I could see Maurice nodding that this could be any kind of infection. There was raised heart rates noted. So, I mean, it has to be taken loosely, but combined with a lot of other metrics to make a clinical decision-making type tree where all of these different factors feed into an algorithm. I once had a friend who wore a watch to indicate his sleep, and he said, I died 4 times last night.
Yeah, no, I think wearables will play an important part, but they need to be integrated, as you quite rightly say. So one of the things that I find really excited about the current situation is the pace of technological change. And the bedrock of our provision has been PCR, it's been kind of traditional antibody testing. Have we seen anything particularly tantalizing come through from a technical perspective that we think might change the landscape in the next couple of years in terms of changing our reliance on these traditional technologies going forward? Anyone can pitch into that, so have you got a thought?
We're seeing a lot of CRISPR involvement in diagnostics and combining the kind of molecular biology with the lateral flow device. And I'm involved in a few companies in America where they're hoping to develop like a 25-minute saliva test where CRISPR-Cas12 is involved in being able to show a band on a lateral flow device to see whether or not there's any virus present. And moving forward, I don't know if everyone involved in major companies and major big corporations who want to know, is this person safe to come into work? You can't rely on a virus test from a week ago or a month ago or an antibody test. There's such a demand in terms of people wanting to know now, before you come through my doors, or have you got the virus? Is there any way where we can detect the virus in-house in a machine where someone gives a sample? Yeah. It sounds not achievable, but it's something that people are asking for.
Oh, it will be. I mean, Tara, I firmly believe it will happen because people need it to happen. You know, the incentive has just not been there, you know, on a global scale to drive this level of invention. But, you know, it absolutely, you know, is there now. So, you know, there will be a huge number of these things coming forward. And I think the trick as a nation and as venture capitalists and funders, be they public or private sector, it's picking the winners and driving those. Now, you know, there've been a number of false starts in diagnostics, and some of them, you know, big name cases, particularly in the US. But you know, we have huge amounts of invention, and we have an absolute need. So it will happen.
I'm glad.
And so I guess this brings me to a kind of a tension that's always been there in diagnostics, in the kind of the area of lab tests versus point of care tests. It's a very complicated issue, but I know that, you know, I can remember pounding the floor at Medica looking for a PCR test that was under 15 minutes, even before this, you know, kind of like the holy grail, to turn that kind of molecular testing from a lab-based test into something, as Tara described, can be employed in a work environment. I'm going to ask Maurice this because I know, you know, you're well aware of the tension between a kind of reliable point of care testing and well-regulated, well-standardized lab tests that are employed centrally. Can you just talk a little bit about how that might change going forward, Maurice?
Yeah, so I mean, the important thing here in terms of point of care is quality and proper regulation to assure quality. And there are frameworks that can be put in place to do that. And it is important to remember that point of care testing already plays a very, very major role. So, for example, in my own trust, we do about 1 million point of care tests per year. And that's equivalent to, you know, the number of samples that we would analyse in any one of our blood sciences department. So point of care testing already has a very major role. I have no doubt that is set to increase, and I think the COVID crisis has shown the importance of being able to assess patients rapidly and accurately, so that you can start treatment and so you can triage them and put them in the right flow pathways. The other consequence of COVID is that healthcare as we know it has to a large extent changed. So our outpatient departments are not going to be the same again. Our acute care facilities are not going to be the same again. There's going to be much more care given outside of hospital, and I think point of care is going to have an important role there. As a society, we are aging. Chronic disease is now the major cost of the NHS. It takes up, I think, 60 to 70% of the NHS budget. And laboratory tests are really, really central in managing many chronic diseases. So if you've got good point of care tests undertaken with, you know, undertaken an appropriate quality framework to a high standard, with connectivity so that results can go into electronic care records, etc., that has the potential to transform healthcare. And so I think this is coming. I mean, if you look at the point of care testing diagnostics market, the value of that globally, I think, doubles every 5 or 6 years, and currently accounts for about 10% of the in vitro diagnostic spend. So that is increasing, and I think the COVID pandemic is going to accelerate the rate of that.
Richard, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, I think certainly the point of care, I completely agree with that. The other thing that is changing as well is the genomic sequencing. So where the knowledge of somebody's genome, if you like, may be available throughout their lifetime and affect treatment as well. We're moving more towards that, and that may mean that certain diagnostics have already been performed for so many years ago, and we can just delve into that information. So that may change the way that diagnostics are delivered. The other thing, probably moving a little bit away from the COVID space, but more towards the cancer, is the non-invasive approaches to biomarkers as well. And we're seeing an increase in the use of those, the liquid biopsy approaches, potentially metabolomics as well. It's always been on the horizon, it's never quite made it. But again, we're seeing these moves. The issues we have at the moment is they're not quite sensitive enough for the purposes of the companion diagnostic space, but they are improving. The only other thing I'd mention, Rob, as you mentioned, would have impact in the next couple of years. I've been at this for 15 years now, and it seems to be things which were just around the corner 10 years ago are only making it now as diagnostic tests. So it seems to be a long, laborious process still, particularly in the companion diagnostic space. Most of the most recent diagnostics coming through are still in the PCR realm. So there's a bit to go.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Richard. 5 minutes to go here, so I'm going to ask my guest raffle ticket picker to reach into the virtual tombola of questions and pick another one, if you will, Chris, please.
Okay, so let me have a look. I've seen the instrument companies getting involved in mass spec based analysis. So let's throw over, let's start to get beyond the biology measuring biology to now analytics measuring the chemistry that we're all built of. So let's get down to the basics. Does mass spec offer us a very much more holistic and high fidelity approach than trying to measure biology through biology?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. Maurice, I'm going to throw this hospital past to you in the hospital. How practical would mass spec be as a clinical tool?
Well, so many laboratories have mass spec equipment already for various types of analytes. I think the really interesting thing is that the number of analytes that can be measured or assessed through mass spec is going to increase significantly. So, for example, to take lipids, so traditionally we have run lipid clinics on the basis of measuring cholesterol, HDL, cholesterol, triglycerides, and LDL, and worked out cardiovascular risk. There are now mass spec techniques which allow us to look at a whole range of different apolipoproteins, which have got different functions and which allow you to assess much more accurately the residual risk of patients, for example, that you've put on a statin and have treated to a conventional target. So I think this is going to open whole new avenues of how we assess patients. And by allowing us to assess patients in different ways, it's going to lay the foundations for clinical trials of interventions that can reduce those risks. So I think there are very exciting things coming in mass spec.
Excellent, thanks, Maurice. Well, we've just got 3 minutes left, so I think we'll probably move to kind of closing reflections. I mean, we've clearly established that a lot has happened over the past few months in the world of diagnostics, and the industry, as part of a larger industry, looks very different to what it did before. I'll just go around the table on some closing reflections, and Tara, I'll just start with you. What do you think? What's your reflection given the conversation of the last hour?
Well, I think an overriding priority remains here that we have to save lives. I don't ever before in any of our lifetimes did we be in a situation where we had friends and family who were dying, who were perfectly healthy individuals. So be it a PCR diagnostic, be it antibody levels to give people some level of confidence to go out, or be it in terms of vaccine. We have to move forward in ways rapidly and quickly to prevent death, and that's, I suppose, never has it been so at the forefront of our mind as it has been during this pandemic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Maurice, have you got a reflection?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my reflection would be is that there has now been a very, very strong spotlight on clinical diagnostics, and we need to take advantage of that. There is much better public and professional understanding of the diagnostics, and I think it's important that we take advantage of that from both a clinical perspective, a research perspective, and a diagnostics industry perspective. You know, I think there is an opportunity here for sure.
Absolutely. And Richard?
Yes, Senator Maurice, I think it's that appreciation actually from the medical profession, but also the general population about the importance of diagnostic assays. And also, I think also the importance of quality diagnostic assays, because I think one important message is that bad diagnostic is worse than no diagnostic. I think that message has come out now as well. People understand if you buy a kit from a dubious source and it gives you a negative result, it doesn't really mean very much. And that's, I think, a lesson maybe quite a few people have learned.
And finally, Chris.
I think COVID has taken, but it's also given. And what it's given, I think, is this understanding that we need a diagnostics industry in this country. We have, you know, the general public talking about false positives and false negatives. Who thought that would happen? And we have the opportunity now. I'll stop that. We have the obligation now to build upon this and set those diagnostic inventions free. And we have all of the momentum now in the UK. Nobody can turn around and say, oh, well, we haven't got a diagnostics industry, so don't worry anymore. Don't bother yourself with it. Now the momentum is with us, and it'll be our own fault and our own shame if we don't make the best of it.
Well, what an inspiring point to end on, Chris. And thanks very much for that. We'll draw it to a close there, folks. Thanks everybody who attended. We will try to kind of feed back the notes and the output. Thanks very much to the panel, especially Chris for picking the questions. And Maurice provided me the nice segue into our next fireside chat, which will be focused on aging and healthy aging. So that's in front of our minds as we all survive the COVID pandemic and move on to a situation as normal. So thank you everybody for your participation and listening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye now.